is really to inform you of this project. Let me say that again. The purpose of this webinar is to inform you about this research project, to tell you what it is about, and also to give you some space to ask some questions. We will discuss the background of the project. Actually, I think I have a slide that should tell you this also. Yeah, the background of the project. So why did we start this? What gave us the reason to start it? What is the project about? What are its aims and its outcomes? We will discuss 3 different case studies, and we will end with a Q&A. When the Q&A comes, you will be able to ask questions in written form. So if you go to the bottom of your screen here, you should be able to click on something that says Q&A, and that's where you can type your questions. You can type them at any time you like, but we will be discussing and answering them only at the end of, after about half an hour or so, maybe a little bit more. And I will be your moderator. I'm joined here by Guled Ahmed Jama, who is a researcher from Somaliland, Ayad Abu Aktash from Palestine, and Mariam Muradian from Armenia. And they will introduce themselves a little bit more in detail when they will be speaking to you. So first, I will tell you something about the background of the project. We first, in 2019, we started at Maastricht University, we started a project called the Invisible Children Project. And this was a project about the development rights of children who are living in unrecognized or de facto states. Now, what is a de facto state? In case you haven't heard of it, you can see some examples here. There are various definitions of de facto states in the literature. And the one that we used in our project is that it is a state that adheres to all the Montevideo criteria for statehood. So this means that there is a defined population, there's a more or less defined territory, there is a government, and there is the capacity to enter into relations with other states. However, it is not fully recognized by other states as an entity, or not. Some are somewhat recognized, some are not recognized at all by other states. And specifically in our definition, these de facto states do not have full United Nations memberships. They are not United Nations member states. Almost all states in the world are United Nations members, but these de facto states are not. And this is why also a state that comes very close to full statehood, namely Palestine, is also included in this definition. What you see here are the maps at the time of when we started this project, so in 2019. These are some examples of such de facto states. So there's Palestine, there's Somaliland in the middle, and then on the right there's the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or sometimes referred to simply as Northern Cyprus. Now, what is the problem? Why should we look at this specific as a category of problems for children's rights, let's say? The problem is that if you are not a UN member state, you usually cannot ratify or sign international human rights treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this means, as a consequence, that for most of these de facto states, with the exception of Palestine, because it has a special status under the UN, there, in some sense, these children do not have rights, at least not under international law or under international human rights law. So our project was initially studying 2 things. First of all, legally speaking, do these children have rights at all? And second, we did several case studies in various areas to study the empirical situation. So what is the situation for children living in these areas in terms of children's rights? We have already published some results of this project. This is of the Invisible Children Project. So, for example, there's this report, Born in a Non-Existent Place, Towards Inclusive Global Rights Protection for Children Living in De Facto States. This includes a number of brief case studies, as well as a legal analysis, particularly of how the international legal system could protect the rights of these children. There's Guled's PhD thesis, Do Our Children Have Rights? Children's Rights in the Unrecognized State of Somaliland. And then there's a report on the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. These are only 3 publications, but there are more. So you can always look at our website, which is www.childrensrightsresearch.com. And there you can find lots of publications that were the result of this previous project. But now we are here to discuss the Child War Project. And so this is an extension. In the previous project, we had a quote in our application from a child that lived in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And this child says, "It hurts when I'm growing up because all the dreams that you have are limited. You can't really evolve roots because something might come up, like a political solution that will change the whole game." So we started that project in 2019, and then in 2020, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, after decades of peace and ceasefire, was again engaged in a war against Morocco. And then in 2023, also a conflict erupted in the Las Anod region, like Gulay will tell you a little bit more about. And then in September 2023, Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Republic of Artsakh, also erupted into a new war, and the population became displaced as a result of that. And then in October 2023, of course, a new level of war between Israel and particularly Gaza. So all of this showed us the vulnerability also of children living in de facto states and how indeed very vulnerable these places are and subject to political changes as well. So that's why we started the Child Work Project. And I will stop here and hand over to Gulet, who can tell us a little bit more about this new project.
Thank you very much, Marita, for the presentation, and thanks everyone for getting time to come. The Child World Project, which is a follow-up of the project just explained by Marika, has questions that are leading the project. For instance, what is the children's rights in situations for children living in the de facto state during and directly after war? When there is a war, what is the situation of rights of children? What rights do they have under international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law? Who is supposed to protect them? Who has the obligation under international law to protect them? How are their rights currently protected, if at all? How could their rights be better protected, in particular for children in Gaza, in Las Hano, and children living in Nagorno-Karabakh, the three case study areas we are going to discuss. So these are the key leading questions of the project. Next slide, please. What is the goal? Why are we going to do this research? Marika explained the situation and status of de facto states and how it is very difficult for children in these places to access their rights and their rights to be protected. So our aim, our goal here is to inform international community, including the academics, researchers, international human rights bodies, on the legal obligations and possibilities on these different actors to protect the rights of children living in de facto state during and directly after war. So more of giving awareness and information to key stakeholders, including the academia and international actors. Secondly, to inform relevant actors about the situation of children's rights during and directly after war in three areas we selected. These are Gaza, Las Anod, and Nagorno-Karabakh, which have special or particular case studies which we are going to address. The third goal is to study the position of children during and directly after war in these three recent wars in de facto states and present lessons learned for potential future wars in similar situations. So the lessons to be learned from these places can be replicated for other places that have similarities. So what lessons can we draw from these places? Next, please. In order to have such research and provide awareness and information to the different stakeholders, we are going to carry out first legal doctrinal research, which means we're going to study international law, particularly international humanitarian law and human rights law, to research the status and protection available under international law for children living in de facto states during war. That is a legal doctrinal research which I'm going to do, and it will have, of course, effect not only to the three case studies, but to entire similar de facto states. Next. Apart from the legal doctrinal research, we're going to have three separate but interrelated case studies. One will be in Gaza, Palestine. The second will be Las Anod, children's rights during and directly after war in Las Anod and in Gaza. And the third case study, children's rights during and directly after war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Republic of Artsakh. three case studies we will be going to discuss separately by the three researchers who are going to do that. So one was legal doctrinal. The second research we are going to do is case studies on the ground on these three areas. What are these three areas? How we're going to do that in terms of methodology of the case studies. The first phase of the methodology, which is very important and special, is that we first talk to children living in the relevant areas. For instance, children in Gaza, we talk to them. Children from Nagorno-Karabakh, children from Las Ano, and discuss with them what, according to them, according to children, is the main issue for children in their current situation. So we co-research with children and explore the children's situation and what they see as a child rights issues in their place. And this is very unique, particular methodology, because we are not going to impose and decide as a researchers what we have to research about, but we co-research with children, and children themselves decide what is the issue to be researched about. When that is clear and determined by talking to children, the second phase is based on the input from that first phase. We then design semi-structured interview protocols to discuss with relevant adult actors the applicable norms of various normative orders in that area, which violate and or protect children's rights in relation to the issue. So the second phase is decided by the first phase. When we talk to children and decide the issue, then we go to the second phase where we interview and talk to the adults on these various norms, plural norms applicable in these case studies. The case studies will be separately done by three researchers, and we will be talking about these three case studies later separately. Next, please. Okay. What kind of impact are we foreseeing from the research? Number one, for the case studies, based on the findings for each case study, we create a theory of change model to determine the intervention that will most likely improve the living condition of children, and then we rescue these ideas. So after the research, on the empirical research on the ground, on the case study, we come together, we also consult with experts, and from the findings and results, we then create theory of change, and from that we create what kind of interventions can be done to improve the situation of rights of children. That is a better system. At the international advocacy level, we have intention to change the international legal political system to include children living in de facto states, which are currently excluded. So we wanted them to be included. In order to do that, based on the research we're going to do from the legal aspect and from case study aspect, we are going to design recommendations to relevant international political actors, publish a report, and engage in advocacy activities. So both the case study and international legal doctrinal will inform a report with recommendations that will be shared with the relevant international actors with the aim of realizing inclusion of rights of children in the political and legal system and the international legal framework. Next, please. One of the things we're going to do after getting the report and putting in place recommendations as a result of the research is to meet with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and other children and human rights actors international level to share with these findings and recommendations. And we already have established a relationship with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, because we have shared it with the report recently shown to you by Mareka in Geneva. So they are aware of this research, and then we're going to continue engaging with them and sharing with the recommendations to them. We will also prepare rules of procedure for the committee itself and how to engage children living in de facto state. That is something missing now. Although committee members are very interested to include everybody, all the children, and engage in one way or another, the absence of rules of procedure is a hindrance. And in our last meeting, they suggested if we could prepare such a procedure, it will be very useful for them. So at the end of the research, we're going to have that procedure in place and share with the committee, which we think will be very important, practically speaking, for the committee and the rights of the children. Next.
Next is for Mariam, actually.
Good.
Thank you very much, Guled, for explaining that. Again, if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A box that you find at the bottom or on the top of the screen, depending on your viewing settings. And you can type your questions there and we will discuss them after finishing the speaking part. So I would then now invite Mariam to speak about the case study for children from Artsakh.
Thank you, Marike. Good afternoon. I'm Maria Muradian. I'm Child Rights Regional Officer based at Yerevan State University in Armenia. I'll try to be short whilst giving an understanding of complexity of the region and human rights in Nagorno-Karabakh. Let's begin with a map. A snapshot of centuries-old struggle. On the map, you can see how complex the geopolitical area is, including great territories of Russia, Turkey, usually supporting Azerbaijan and Iran. The map is after the war of 2020, where dark gray area are the piece of land Azerbaijan was negotiating for 30 years. However, the red part, together with the gray, which was never recognized by any UN country, including Armenia, was called Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, as claimed in 2017, after the takeover of great lands and major cities of Shushi and Hadrut in 2020, where the rest was attacked after 9.5 months of blockade of 2023. Armenian presence here dates to the 5th century before the Christ, with Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh as a cultural heartland. If we can pass to the next slide, I try to give very little hints about the history. In 1923, Stalin carved the region into Azerbaijan's Soviet borders, an arbitrary act that highlighted decades of tension. The 44-day war in Artsakh from September 27 to November 9th of 2020 saw Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, launch a military offense to reclaim territories lost in 1990s, deploying advanced drones and artillery that devastated civilian infrastructure. A Russian brokered ceasefire forced Armenians to cede key territories, displacing thousands and leaving Artsakh's Armenian population vulnerable to systemic isolation under Azerbaijani control. The conflict set the stage for 2023 blockade. As mentioned, the blockade, which lasted 9.5 months, from December 2022 to September 2023, saw Azerbaijan seal the Lachin corridor. It was a 5-kilometer corridor cutting off food, medicine, energy to 120,000 Armenians in a systematic campaign of collective punishment, as was condemned by the International Court of Justice. This deliberate siege induced a man-made humanitarian catastrophe, with children enduring starvation, untreated illnesses, and disrupted education in violation of Geneva Conventions. The blockade escalation into Azerbaijan's 2023 military offenses triggered the forced exodus of Artsakh's entire Armenian population. As the ICRC reporting, there were only 12 Armenians left after 120,000, erasing their ancestral homelands and completing a cycle of ethnic cleansing under the pretense of territorial sovereignty. If we can pass to the last slide, as actually I have, the blockade and wars over Artsakh from 2020 to 2023 violated children's rights under the CRC, ICCPR, ICACR, through deliberate deprivation of food, medicine, and education, psychosocial trauma from displacement and shelling, compounded by targeted attacks on schools, hospitals, breaching UNCS Resolution 2601. The forced exodus of 30,000 children during Azerbaijani 2023's offenses meet the Roma Statute definition of ethnic cleansing and erasing their cultural identity and right to return. These systemic abuses demand urgent accountability under the Geneva Conventions and Genocide Convention, with the international community obliged to investigate, document, and prosecute perpetrators to uphold the right for future generations. Before my presentation, I was told that the case is the least known to the world, but maybe this is the reason why thousands of people lost their homeland and actually the right to their identity. Actually, the threats are still present both to the population of Artsakh, but displaced to Armenia, to Armenians in Armenia, and to the sovereign territory of Armenia itself, since Azerbaijan has no peace deal and there is no peace deal to be negotiated in the nearest future. Within the case study of the project, we'll talk with the co-researcher children, as it was mentioned by my colleague Gulait, about their stories. Unfortunately, life experienced child rights violations to do our best as scientists and advocates for their rights to be redressed and restored. I'll be very happy to answer to the questions at the very end of the session. I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for a quick overview of a very complex situation indeed. We may in the future also resort to organizing more webinars on specific case studies in case there is an interest. And then we now move to Gaza with my colleague Ayed. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Marika. Despite the fact that the research project will be with children from Gaza Strip, but what's applicable to children from Gaza Strip is applicable also to Palestinian children who are living in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, because West Bank, including Jerusalem, alongside Gaza Strip, collectively constitute the occupied Palestinian territories that Israel occupied in the year 1967. I believe that Palestine does not meet the definition of de facto state, as you highlighted before, because it differs from Somaliland and Nagorno-Karabakh because de facto state functions like a state with territorial control but lacks the jure sovereignty in the eyes of international community. Palestine differs from such de facto state in two ways, through its recognition and interaction with international institutions and international community. Palestine is state party after the year 2014, becomes state party to almost all core human rights conventions and also state party to the Rome Statute. So it differs also through its unique socio-legal status. So Palestine is a state under illegal occupation, the longest of its kind in modern history, under threat of annexation by the State of Israel. Palestine's right to self-determination has been deliberately violated to enable illegal settler colonization. So if we take Montevideo Convention as a criteria, we can see that Palestine possesses the main key criteria for statehood, mainly permanent population, defined territory, government, the capacity to enter into relation with other states. As such, Palestine statehood meets the key criteria for statehood under international law. The problem that despite the overwhelming recognition by UN member states, of which its participation in international treaty demonstrates its capacity for diplomatic relation and fulfilling key criteria for statehood under international law, but Palestine's status as non-member observer state at UN, as well as its recognition and participation in global institutions such as International Criminal Court, affirms its de jure statehood, even if it is denied full sovereignty. At the time being, 146 members of the UN recognized Palestinian statehood. Before becoming a state party or observatory member of the UN, Palestine was not allowed to submit reports to the UN monitoring bodies that monitor the implementation of international human rights conventions, but civil society organization, mainly Palestinian civil society organization, used to submit reports to the UN monitoring committee, like the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And always the committee, whenever examining the Israeli reports, argued that Israel is responsible for the implementation of the rights of Palestinian children who are living under the Israeli occupation, despite the fact that Israel used to argue that human rights conventions are not applicable to the occupied Palestinian territories. But in all its recommendation, for example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, including some recommendation for the State of Israel to uphold the rights of Palestinian children who are living under the Israeli occupation. But Israel do not implement any of these recommendations, and during all cycle of the revising the Israeli reports, almost the Committee on the Rights of the Child used to repeat the same recommendations to the State of Israel as occupying power to the occupied Palestinian territories. After the year 2014, after being a member or observatory member of United Nations, Palestine started to submit its report in order to be examined by the monitoring body to its record of human rights status as obliged under the human rights conventions. But still, we regard that Israel is responsible because Israel is practicing effective control in the occupied Palestinian territories. And the problem that despite all the reports and all the information submitted by Palestinian human rights organization, Israeli human rights organization, and UN organization, Israel is still violating the rights of Palestinian children who are living in the occupied Palestinian territories, but the international community do not pressure Israel to abide to its legal obligations. So the problem is not related to whether this country is a full-fledged member of the United Nations or not, but it's related to the problem of enforcement and monitoring of human rights law. That's why Israel is continuing its violation to Palestinian children's rights without intervention from international community to pressure Israel to abide to its legal obligation under international human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayad. Then we move on to the last case study, and I would invite Gula to speak.
Thank you very much. So the last case study is Seoul and Sanaa. When we first started the research, it was only Seoul, but now they've expanded. And I'll a little bit explain that later. But let me give you some context and history without going too much, because history itself is very contested in de facto states. People disagree on it. So in 1960, Somaliland, British protectorate, became independent, and Somalia, Italian rule, became independent. They joined the union to form the Somali Republic. A civil war later erupted in the Somali Republic, and in the year 1991, Somaliland British protectorate announced separation from Somalia and said, we are no longer part of the union. It established a government and a state as defined by Marika in her early presentation, but it is not internationally recognized as a state. So it lacks recognition, but function is like a state. In the year 2023, particularly in February, a war erupted in the city of Las Anod, which is the administrative capital of Seoul region. The war was between the government forces of Somaliland and local, first with the local groups who were armed. And that war later ended in the ouster of Somaliland from the capital city of Las Anod, 25th August 2023. An administration was formed in Las Anod called SCC Khartoum, which doesn't accept the authority of Somaliland. Now the two sides are facing each other in an area called Og. So what is the issue here? Somaliland is not a recognized state, it is a de facto state. And it was involved in the year 2023 and still involved a violent armed conflict with other armed groups. And the rights of children were affected. Many of them were displaced. Thousands of them were displaced. Schools were closed. The children's ward of the main hospital was shelled. Children died and others were wounded. So many rights of children were violated during the conflict between Somaliland and the other armed group. But Somalia is not a recognized state, as been explained, and that is the challenge we are going to investigate in terms of the international legal doctrine aspect. But when it comes to case study aspect, the empirical aspect, we'll be talking to the children in Seoul. A couple of months later, the violence that started in Las Ano expanded to a neighboring region called Senag. So although we first intended to research only Seoul, Las Ano, now the same conflict expanded to Seoul. So the research is Senag and Seoul now, as it was first Las Ano, but still Las Ano is the main place. And we are going to talk children on first phase and the second phase to talk to adults. That is the situation in the other case study I'm going to lead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, well, if you have any questions about any of these cases or anything about the project, feel free to ask them. You can type them in the Q&A box that is either on top or at the bottom of your screen, as mentioned before. We already received some questions, so I will read them and then ask one of our panelists or all of them to answer. I'm going to start with the first question, which is, doesn't the Children's Rights Treaty apply to the de facto states anyway as international customary law? I was very happy to see this question because I think Guled is the person to answer this, since this was actually a key question also in his PhD thesis, and it is again in his current research. So Guled, I suggest you answer this one.
Okay, this is a very difficult question because under our assumption, international human rights treaties should be applicable to everybody. But there are two main challenges. Number one is these treaties are based on consent of the states. State parties voluntarily sign to it, and it is applicable on the territory of these states unless it is extraterritorial jurisdiction issues. But the challenge is de facto states, the exception of Palestine, of course, de facto states cannot currently ratify, although there are solutions we present in our previous report, cannot ratify a treaty. So the applicability becomes a problem because a treaty, for instance, the CRC is applicable to Somalia, but Somalia lost the effective control of Somaliland. So under international law, if a state loses effective control of a territory, it no longer has jurisdiction to carry obligations. But the entity that has effective control, which is Somaliland, is not recognized as such as a state. It is not permitted to report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So that is where predicament is, and it's a very challenge. In our previous report and in my PhD, we provided some practical recommendations where these de facto states can be held accountable and can be permitted to ratify treaties, but currently that is not the case. So for instance, in the UN CRC, they don't review Somaliland as a state, or they don't put emphasis. Also, the committee addresses and deals with these different de facto states inconsistently. Sometimes it's mentioning, sometimes it's not mentioning. So there are a lot of practical problems that exist. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you for a minute, Guled, because the next question also relates, I think, to this question. So the question is, in places like Las Anot, where children live in a de facto state and face real war but have no international voice, how can we ensure their rights are protected and their trauma is not ignored just because their country doesn't exist?
Yes, and that is one of the things we are researching. We want to come up with solutions of how that works. You're very right to raise this question. It's the question we want to answer. Hopefully, we might not answer, but we are very hopeful to answer, because we are coming from the notion that all children, no matter what they are, whether the place is recognized or not, should have rights and their rights protected. And the status of the territory should not negatively affect their rights. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, then there's a question about children's issues in the 3 case studies and what normative orders were addressed. The question is, could we give some examples? Maybe I can answer that one briefly because the thing is that we're just starting this project. So for the 3 case studies that you've just heard about, we don't know yet which children's rights issues we will address, and we don't know yet what normative orders will be addressed. So this depends on this phase 1 study. It depends on what we find in phase 1, what children can decide what our studies should be about. So per case study, this might be actually quite different, depending on what we learn from children. And if that's okay, I will also then go into another question that is related, I think. There are actually 2 questions about the ethical considerations about doing research with children, and especially in the context of war or trauma. I would like to answer that one as well, since I designed the methodology, so that is mainly my problem, and then I discuss it with colleagues and they help me as well. So Ilse, in our previous study, we also had empirical data collection, and we also worked with children, so it was somewhat related to that. There are many, many things to say about ethics and working with children in general, in war situations in particular, and when it comes to trauma also. But let me, because we are short on time, I mean, we could spend the whole webinar just on that topic, and it would be very interesting. If there is any interest, I would love to do that. But one thing that I think is core in our methodology is, as I said, and as Bulat has said, children are co-researchers in our project. This means that we have developed a certain technique. We use Socratic dialogue, for example, which is an educational technique that I have adapted to be used in this kind of empirical research. It means that we sit down with children and together we have a research question, and we're going to work together to answer this research question. And this research question is, depending on the case study, but just to take the Lozano, for example, you sit down with a child from that region and you say, okay, what is the children's rights situation for children from this region, from Lozano, or from the Sol and Sanag region? And you're going to discuss that together. And why this is particularly important also from an ethics perspective is that in this way, you find that you really must listen to the child. And this is very difficult for adults, I can tell you. We've been training the whole week and we are all children's rights specialists, and still it's challenging because you have to let go of control of your study and you have to listen to what the child comes up with. And it also means that sometimes you may find, I'm going to give one specific example. So we just did a training in Armenia and we spoke with some children from Artsakh as a first trial to practice this methodology. And there was, for example, a child who really wanted to talk about her experience of the war and her experience of fleeing from Artsakh to Armenia. And she shared many stories and details that were not directly relevant to our study, in the sense that it wasn't really about a specific children's rights violation. But you could tell that from the way she was speaking, she really needed to talk about this. Like, it was almost like a therapeutic session in that way. So what we do is we give that space to children, if whatever they want to talk about, and we really listen to them, and we give them that space, and we then say, okay, and then we go back to this research question, like, okay, and how is this particular experience related to the children's rights situation? So I think an ethical aspect is that you give them all that space and you give them someone who listens to them. However, of course, in case of like serious trauma, if you find that a child is not comfortable or is too traumatized to speak, you end the interview. And for each of the case studies, we also have a psychologist that we can connect them to, and that can help them if they really need like trauma help. I hope that answers the question. There's so much more I want to say about that, but let's go to some other questions as well, because I can talk about this for hours. Next question for Mariam. I've been wondering, was Nagorno-Karabakh ever considered a country in its own right, especially during the time of the USSR?
Well, thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my slides, Nagorno-Karabakh during the USSR has the status of autonomous oblast, which is autonomous region. And its independence as based on the principle that I mentioned. There are 2 principles that are always contested. So the principle of self-determination, and based on that principle, they were announced as a separate country as a result of referendum of 1991, supported by the Armenian government. Back then, still Soviet, but also the independence of Armenia was also in the middle of happening. So during the USSR, if we start in the early times, in 1923, it was oblast, and in 1991, when there was no USSR, it proclaimed it independent. So not in times of USSR, but after that. And it lasted till January 1st, 2023, as I mentioned, as a result of the forced exodus and as a result of the forced announcement of the government of Artsakh, who is currently are detained in Baku as prisoners of war. Everyone, including the current, former presidents, former heads of the parliament, and approximately 16 people.
Thank you very much. Can you still hear me? Because I had to switch headphones. Yes, I see from the smile, everything's okay. Okay, good. So there are more legal questions here as well. I think we have to go back to Gulet for this one. So there's also a question about what about the principle of jus cogens? Is it not applicable to de facto country and children? Gulet, could you answer that, but also explain what the principle of jus cogens is exactly for those non-lawyers in the audience?
Yes, principles of jus cogens are preemptive norms of international law. They are basic norms that protect human beings from the most heinous kind of violations, for example, against genocide. And they are applicable to everybody anywhere. So, of course, jus cogens are applicable to de facto states. But as we all know, jus cogens protect in a very special, limited rights. Not all the rights of children, not all the rights of human beings, but it is applicable to de facto states, United States actors, everybody on the earth, legally speaking.
Okay, thank you. And what is the role of customary law in this field? Could you add that one as well?
The customary law has some similarities with the treaty law in the sense that it is also based on the state practice, recognized state practice, with opinion of the state, the legal opinion of the state. So although it has greater reach than treaty law in terms of applicability, but it's still that state-centric nature makes it limited in terms of applicability. And there's always debate on what rights, children's rights, can be considered as a customary international law. International rights. So it is better protected, but it has some limitations as well. That's very similar with treaty law. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have here a question that might be for Ayad or maybe for Gulet or both. Maybe you can indicate who you think can answer this best. But the question is, if children's rights are neglected intentionally by actors operating in de facto states, does the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, accept to file a case against such human rights violations?
Basically, this depends on whether the country acceded to the Rome Statute or not. So in the case of Palestine, the state of Palestine is part to the Rome Statute. That's why we can submit complaints to the ICC in relation to the mandate of Rome Statute. So there are some complaints related to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity that Israel commit in the occupied Palestinian territories. So it depends on whether the state is the state party to Rome Statute or not. But in principle, if yes, we can accede to the ICC.
Thank you. Gulet, did you want to add something to that, or is that
very
yeah?
little, because the ICC is established under a treaty called the Rome Statute, and it provides when it is applicable. So one important one is that the state is a party to it, and the de facto state cannot be part to currently cannot be part of the Rome Statute. But in theory, it could be applicable if the country the parent country, as they call, for instance, Somalia, in the case of Somaliland, has ratified the treaty, the ICC may have a room. So the determination of whether the ICC has jurisdiction over the place solely depends on the Rome Statute.
Okay, thank you. Then Guled, if I can continue with you, there's a question about the field work. Can you give insight in how you move in the field, imagining that there are many restrictions and repressions? Maybe you can answer that for your case study, and then we move on to the other speakers.
Yeah, in a conflict places, movement isn't easy. It's very difficult in terms of security of the researchers, security of the people you want to research. So it is practically speaking, there are so many difficulties. In our meeting we had in Europe recently, we discussed it extensively on that and come up ways to address it. So I will go the areas I think I have access safely. I will be assisted a researcher. We're going to train in other areas. I might not be able to have access, but that other person have access in terms of security wise. But the basic line here is that we don't want to put any parties at risk, whether it's a researcher or others. So we will try to do the research practically as safe as possible, taking into the consideration of how risky and dangerous these places could be. But of course, Gaza is more dangerous than anywhere else, and Ayat can a little bit add on that.
Yes, Ayat, if you could also answer this question.
For the field work in Gaza now, it's very risky for the field workers to move around and interview children. So we try our best to protect the field workers and to protect the children. So at the time being, we may postpone the interview with children until a truce is reached between Palestinians and Israel.
Yeah, maybe also to add there that we do have 4 local researchers in Gaza who will be trained online, and then we'll execute the data collection. I mean, for as long at least as Ayat cannot personally go there. Of course, if this changes, then hopefully he could go, but it doesn't look that way at the moment. And Mariam, did you want to comment on this as well for your case study?
The case of Nagorno-Karabakh is specific because actually we'll be meeting people who were displaced after 2023. And we are going to meet them in Armenia, basically. There is no access to Nagorno-Karabakh, neither for Armenians nor for Azerbaijani, neither for monitoring missions, and the access has been denied by the start of 2020 and during the blockade. And actually, the exodus and the one-day war in 2023 started evaporating because the humanitarian support by Council of Europe and led by France was supposed to enter the country. Basically, Azerbaijan was blocking any monitoring missions, any human rights missions to the land. And so far, it wouldn't give also much information within the remits of the research. And the children's rights violations are monitored during the war and after the war, after being applicable to Armenia and also the communities of displaced population. And within the war, during the war, of course, there are going to be the stories and violations that have been monitored by people. And also, as we mentioned, with the second phase, we will engage experts based on the violations children indicated to understand what have been monitored before, during the war, and before the period of war. The timeline itself includes only 5 years for our case, and this is also very individually designed and decided per case.
Thank you very much. Okay, then there are some questions about the application of international law and rights protection. I'm gonna take them together. Guled, it's mostly for you and the Somaliland case study. I'm gonna read 2 questions and then you can answer them together. So one is, when a country doesn't officially exist, what does protection mean for a child living through war there, and who is actually responsible? And then another question is, what is the Somaliland new government, sorry, no, wrong one. if Somaliland isn't a recognized country by the United Nations, does that mean that the UN has no responsibility or can't really do anything for it? And I think I also saw a question somewhere that was, what is the responsibility of the Somaliland government? So if you could answer those three together.
Thank you very much. And one disclaimer is that when we are doing to do research, for instance, in Las Anod and Seoul, our research has nothing to do who has a right to control, whom his claim is right or wrong. We're simply going to research the rights of children in that particular place. So that's one thing we're going to do. So it is not necessarily about Somaliland or someone else. When it comes to the protection of children living in de facto state, currently the way the international system, international human rights framework established, these children are invisible. They are not seen, they are not discussed, their issues are not debated by the international framework. The human rights bodies, the UN committees, whether it's charter-based or treaty-based, that is a big challenge. And one of the things we're doing this research is to shed the light on the situation, provide these institutions recommendations of what they can do and what is happening on the ground. So the existing framework, practically speaking, is more problematic, but we intend the result of this research to have recommendations that can help these international institutions take their responsibility seriously and help the children, because the system should be inclusive. It shouldn't exclude children living in de facto status or who have engagement with de facto state in this context of war. The responsibility of UN, of course, is different. They are, for example, in Somaliland trying to do things. That's the UN agencies, like UNICEF, UNHCR, and stuff like that. But when it comes to bodies like the Human Rights Center, when it comes to the Human Rights Council, when it comes to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, others like that, who supervise and monitor the implementation of rights by states, they don't address or have any special mechanism to address children living in de facto states. And that is what's missing. We believe they should do that under existing international human rights law, international child rights law, but that's not what are happening now. Our research and the previous research we have done, which is a minimum in terms of the research happening in this context, intends to produce accumulation of knowledge and research for these institutions to take more role. So it helps advocacy mechanisms of international local NGOs, but also the UN treaty bodies. The international system is very problematic because it is a very state-centric, and that is the challenge we are facing. And we are trying to find a way with such a little bit complex state-centric international system, because we believe the rights of children should not be affected by the status of what they are. But in this current one, it is only on war, so it's very limited. It's not all right, it's on peacetime. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, to add to that, so there's also a question on, can we already share some insights on recommendations regarding international cooperation and how to safeguard the rights in de facto states? So this also links back to the previous project. And the report that I mentioned briefly earlier would also detail that more. And give some answers to that already. Now, of course, we're studying this specifically in the context of war or directly after war. But let me say at least that what is key here is that we need to remember all these de facto states are also the subject of political debates, of conflict, because that's why they are de facto. Otherwise, this situation wouldn't be there. So children are living in that reality, and we should not forget that children are children wherever they live. It is not their fault. You know, they are born there, but they didn't choose to be born. They didn't choose to be part of some political conflict that adults created long before they were born. So they should also not, for that reason, have less rights protection than any other child. And that is really a basic departure point of our project. So this is very much key to all of our case studies, to all of our work on this project and the previous project, that these children have equal rights like any other child. And in principle, international law and international human rights law, international humanitarian law would recognize that. You know, children are children everywhere. The UN Charter talks about the peoples of the world, not about the states of the world. Of course, this is the idea where we come from when we look at any kind of human rights law. It's just that, as Guled said, at the end of the day, the legal international system is set up very state-centric, and not everyone is allowed to be a member of the club, so to say, which then affects, legally speaking, but also practically speaking, the rights of children. So it's not only, we've spoken a lot about legal protection and protection mechanisms, but it's also in terms of, for example, if you want to do a development project, in some of these de facto states, it is very difficult to set up, to have a financial transaction. For example, when we want to transfer money to Somaliland, this can be very complicated in our research project. So if you want to do some kind of development project, maybe an education project or healthcare, this is extra challenging. It is politically challenging because if you do anything with a de facto entity, others, those opponents or people, political actors that are well established within the state-centric legal system will oppose you often. What you also see is that, and this depends also on which de facto states we're talking about, but some de facto states, you find hardly any international NGOs operating there doing anything for children's rights because it's so complex, because they don't want to get in trouble. For example, you see this in the Western Sahara. From our studies, we haven't seen any international NGO, and there were also no studies on children's rights in the Western Sahara. And I'm talking about the part that is, depending on your political position, either occupied or under control of Morocco. There were no studies on children's rights there. The Sahrawi camps in Algeria, same story. Somaliland, until Goulet's PhD, there was no study at all on children's rights in Somaliland. So depending a bit on which de facto states you're looking at, there are multiple problems when it comes to children's rights protection. And there's a lot to say about international cooperation, much more than I have time for now. I would refer you to the report as well. And if you're interested in that, of course, please contact us also anytime you like. And we will also be publishing more on this also as results from this particular project. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. That's okay. We just started also a little bit later and there are so many more interesting questions. Let me see. There was a question about, oh yeah, this one I think I can also answer. Will the child co-research also be involved at the advocacy or action stage of the research? That's I love that question. I hope so. At the same time, also related to the question earlier about ethics, we do keep all our participants anonymous. So we do not store their data. So we would not normally be able to contact them again to ask about this. So all the kind of advocacy or action that they can do would be during the data collection phase where they can indicate. For example, last week, a child from Artsakh has shared some paintings that she made, and she's very happy for us to share those paintings and to explain her story. So that in that sense, and also, of course, in that we use their quotes and that we try to give them a voice as much as possible. And also that they have our contact details. So we do encourage them to contact us if they want to be involved in any way. So let's say the door is very open, but we do not contact them because we don't store their contact details in that context because of anonymity. So it will depend a bit on the wishes and the desires and the action of these children that we speak with. Okay, I see there are more questions. Is your methodology purely qualitative or does it incorporate quantitative elements as well? If so, how do you ensure the data on children's rights violations is disaggregated by age, gender, and location, particularly in regions where formal reporting mechanisms are weak or non-existent? Thank you for that question as well. I can say it's mostly qualitative, indeed, interviews. It's also legal doctrinal, as Goulet has explained. We use triangulation. So any other source of data that we can find, depending on the case study, we will use it. If there's good quantitative data available, we will use it. But in many cases, this will be very questionable. Maybe Mariam, do you want to say something about the access to other kinds of data that you might have with the Artsakh case study or that you might not have?
That's an interesting question because in the course of the workshop in Yerevan, we discussed that most of the data, including the human rights reports that have been stored or done unilaterally by Nagorno-Karabakh, has been erased because the government and the Human Rights Defender Office stopped working, hence the official website stopped working. However, the government in Flee still possess the document, which is not published documents, but the ones that they have as a generated file. So it makes the story and makes the case a little bit more difficult. But we'll be relying also on the desk analysis and desk research of the secondary data that we have, including the responses from regional organizations. In case of Armenia, it's also Council of Europe, PASE, and other pre-session documents that we have. Also, as it was referred, most of the countries who have effective control, and before 2020 it was Armenia, who was responsible for the human rights protection in Armenia. The questions concerning child rights protection were addressed to Armenia more. And now the questions have to be addressed to Azerbaijan, but there are no Armenians left, as I mentioned. So the ethnic cleansing has been also confirmed by the ICJ. So there are several decisions and also several ECIGR cases that we can refer while considering the cases. And also the Global Campus of Human Rights have a platform of child participation, referring also to the question. We have conference proceedings, and usually we have discussion with children who are volunteering to present their stories and advocate for their rights. And we also consider these conference proceedings as secondary data for the research too.
Thank you very much. There is a question if we have any guidelines on how to approach children when we do interviews with children because of the ethical issues. Yes, very long guidelines, I may say. We've just spent a week training with this team and we're still not fully there. So yeah, we take that very, very seriously. I have been personally been training researchers to do work with children for quite a number of years now. So if you're also interested in that, we can send you more information and I can discuss it. And we will also be publishing on our websites more about this. I'm thinking of how to publish it because I think most of it takes training. It's something that you cannot just read and then do correctly because it's very much a practice and not just a theory. So I think it requires training, but we do heavy training, let's say. I think everyone's still exhausted from what I put them through during this training.
Marike, the question was
yeah.
about also journalists, and UNICEF has developed a guideline about ethical consideration of journalists interviewing children, and you might also check them, and you have our contacts. You can also see them, which basically meets the best interest and ethical considerations that we were talking about.
Thank you. I saw one more question, but I think should do as the last question, even though I see more interesting questions coming up, but they keep coming up and it's too interesting, but we don't have time anymore, I'm afraid. We might continue another time. But this question I actually want to ask all of us, so maybe one by one we can answer. But the question is, do you think your research could help the UN recognize that this is an important case that deserves attention? Great question. Marianne, you're still on my screen. You want to go first?
Yes, but if you may repeat the question, because I'm also dealing with it
Yes.
for the moment.
Yeah, I'm reading it again. Do you think your research could help the UN recognize that this is an important case that deserves attention?
Thank you for the question. As you said, it's quite important for us, and based on our previous experience and previous project, when the project and the conference was running in the middle of Exodus and in the middle of the blockade, we could see that very little the CRC committee, I'm referring, has to do with the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. And usually the government in case of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, they are quite they were actually reporting to CRC, to the members in the communication, but it was not raised in the committee and it was not basically accessed as a case. So we find it very important. However, the mechanisms that exist for reporting and understanding how to engage their rights are still vague, especially after the announcements of the Armenian government that they withdraw of representing the people's rights in the international courts on behalf of Nagorno-Karabakh. It makes the situation very unique, and basically the people are left without protection. But Europe, as I said, the regional mechanisms like the ECHR still has the possibility to go with individual cases, which requires lots of funds and connections. However, within the remits of the project, we find only the missing scientific data can be the way through. And also, as Marike mentioned, we're going to present the results of the research to the CRC and also find other possibilities to mainstream the children's rights violations that we documented within the project.
Thank you. Ayat, what do you think? Could this research help the UN recognize the importance of the case?
I think regardless of the status of the territory, whether it's recognized or not recognized, facto or de facto, children have rights, and these rights should be protected and respected. And it's the responsibility of UN to find a way in order to protect the rights of children in these areas, because living in unrecognized area doesn't strip them from their rights. And I believe that the UN monitoring bodies and the UN in general should find a way in order to protect these children who are living in such situation, because they are the most vulnerable for human rights violations.
Thank you very much. Guled?
Yes, definitely. Definitely, we think so. And Marika and I met the UN Committee on the Rights of Child last year in Geneva, and they were very interested on the subject. Most of them didn't know about it, but they were very interested and asked us if you can continue developing a procedure for it. So that is the case. And recently we also had a webinar with the international organizations with Child Rights Connect, with the intention of getting them, some organizations, to take advocacy, because we are academics, we are producing something, but we don't have the capacity and the time and expertise to do advocacy at the international level. So if some of you have links, know somebody or organizations who are interested to carry out advocacy in Geneva, New York, and other places with the UN, that would be very important if you can keep in touch with us, because we would like to cooperate with you so that the pressure continues and we keep knocking the door of the UN committees and other bodies, so that they recognize these issues, prioritize them, but also to depoliticize it. These issues are very contested, so sometimes UN institutions shy away. They don't want to get involved in the political contestation involved in them. But I think it's doable, and that's what we are doing. We are very, very hopeful it will work.
Yes, let me echo Guled here. Indeed, I have been pleasantly surprised by the amount of interest at the UN. The amount of, actually, there are too many meetings that people want us to speak at that we cannot even, as researchers, we don't have the resources to address all of these questions and to be there in Geneva and things like that. So there's definitely an interest. And we are, I mean, maybe we are hopelessly optimistic and hopeful, but yeah, we do think otherwise we wouldn't be doing this work, of course. Yes, we believe that we can really make a difference here, or at least we think it's worth a try. But at the same time, we could definitely use support, especially on, I mean, we are researchers, we're doing the research part, but we could definitely use some help with the more the advocacy and the activism part, which is ideally goes hand in hand. So we are also to some extent searching for help in this area. I think we need to end here. Thank you so much for your interest, for taking the time to listen. This also gives us a lot of hope that so many people were interested and willing to come and listen to us online and learn about the topic. We will be working on this for the coming 2 years. And also, when you signed up for this webinar, you entered your email address. So we will be sending you a follow-up email with links to, for example, the website, to resources that we have collected already. We have also possibilities to volunteer for the project if you're interested in that. So we'll be sharing all that, probably more that I don't remember right now. And thank you so much also for your engagement and very good discussion, interesting questions. Thank you to all the speakers for speaking about this topic today. Surely we will organize more online meetings, I think, as we will have more to tell. And clearly there are more topics to delve into. For now, I wish you a very nice day, and I hope we can meet again. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.